A wealthy British boy learns harsh life lessons in a Japanese internment camp. Special guest Jonathan Weissler joins us to chat about boiling frogs, filming in China, and an alternate Batman origin story. Then we see if Empire of the Sun stands the test of time.
Test of time, James and Alan have their say. Do the movies you love still hold up today? James says gladiator with a glut. Alan says as a father, blah blah. It's the test of time, James and Alan have their say. Do the movies you love still hold up today? Test of time, James and Alan have their say. Do the movies you love still hold up today?
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Test of Time. My name is Alan Noah, and joining me, as always, is James Brief, and we have a very special guest here today as well.
I'm very excited about this. We're going to talk about World War II, and we've got a fellow ally here from Great Britain. How you doing, Jonathan?
I'm doing great, boys. How are you?
Good.
Doing very well. So yes, Jonathan Weissler coming back on the show. You joined us last year to talk about Train Spotting, and we were eager to have you back on. And today we're going to talk about Empire of the Sun. Before we started recording, you said that this is one of your favorite movies. The favorite or just one of?
It lives in a very special list.
Okay.
I think it's incredibly close to my heart, and I think it's one of the most magnificent films ever made.
And you also said that you have friends who worked on this movie.
Yeah, quite a few. It was an English crew. So they went out to China. They shot a lot of it in London, and then they finished the movie in Spain. They did all the prison of war camp stuff in Spain. It was the first big movie to shoot in China.
In like 4 decades, right? Like the last one was in the 40s or something.
Yeah, and randomly, I have a place in history for this. I'm the first white guy, Westerner, to ever produce a Chinese film in China.
Wow.
Really?
Yeah, I did that in 2003. I'm showing my age now.
How'd that come about?
So I did 3 movies in Hong Kong, and one of them was a huge hit. And off the back of that, I was doing a lot. I knew a lot of Asian directors and financiers and studios. And I got a call to go out to Shanghai for a meeting and ended up with a movie. So we shot the movie in China, and we shot the movie in London. So
wow.
Yeah, and it was an interesting experience. We were there in 2003. It was like the Wild West. Shanghai didn't even look like it looks today. It was an evolving city.
Really?
And when we were there, Quentin was doing Kill Bill in Beijing. We were in Shanghai doing our movie, which was called Jet Lag. It then changed names. The Chinese translation title is called Life Translated. And it's an awful movie. It's not particularly great, but it was a lot of fun to make. It was very difficult to make, because I was used to the Hong Kong crews. I was lucky I was working with John Woo. Do you know John Woo?
Oh, of course, yeah.
I was working with like the best crews in Hong Kong. And then I went to China, and it was a very different sort of way of working. I remember talking to Bob Richardson, who's Quentin's DOP, cinematographer. He asked me what it's like, because we were shooting first. I said, in London or LA, and you want to like move the tracks a meter and dolly into someone. I said, it's not like that here. I said, you say you want to move the track, and like 40 people swarm the set, and someone picks up the track, and someone is bending down and gets hit in the head. Then someone pulls it, and someone snaps something, and then they put it down, and it's in the wrong place.
Whoa.
It was so overcrewed. And I think it was coming off the communist model, where it was just jobs. So there were so many people. I'd rather have less people, but everyone knows exactly what they're doing.
Right.
If you worked with John Woo, were there doves involved in the production of this?
I didn't work with John Woo. I worked with his crew.
Oh, okay.
I met John, but I worked with his crew. So when I was in Hong Kong, I was working with like their creme de la creme people. And it was great. A lot of them wouldn't get a job in London in those days.
Ha. That's interesting. Have you done another movie in China since then?
No, I've consulted. I was it's a bit NDA'd up, but a couple of big American studio films went to Hong Kong, and invariably they get in a bit of trouble. And a couple of times I get a phone call saying, can I fix it?
Oh, what kind of trouble?
There's an expression in China where you have to work with the river, and you can't stop the river. There was a Michael Bay Transformer movie, and Michael Mann shot a film called Black Cat out there. And I think people were used to throwing money and getting what they wanted. And you can't get the level of control and precision that you get in Europe or America. And I think there were some challenges. And, it's also culturally working with a very, very different mindset. And another Chinese Asian expression is, there's 1,000 ways to climb the mountain,
Okay.
as long as you get to the top. So I remember I was doing one movie in London, and I got a call from the American studio, And they would basically, anything you want, Jonathan, just get on a plane tonight.
Whoa.
And I couldn't. I was on another picture. I was in the middle of a 100-hour week on whichever movie I was doing at the time. And invariably, I said, you've only got one solution. You either work with your environment or you abort, you relocate somewhere else. And that movie literally shut down production. And it was a big, big budget film and relocated to another country in Asia.
Whoa.
So there are some
Wow.
insane things that happen.
I can only imagine how much money it costs to do that, to shut down and start over.
I won't say the name of that film, but yeah, it was a very expensive decision, which probably saved them money in the long run because the director
Sure.
got to shoot the film the way he wanted to.
Right.
And I think it was a director that was used to getting what he wanted, and probably still does.
Mm.
With a bit of planning and a bit of clarity in the beginning, I think that problem could have been avoided.
Interesting.
Yeah. Not only is Empire of the Sun a great movie to me personally as a film lover, it's a world I understand a little bit as well as a filmmaker.
And I find it fascinating because I would consider this one of the lesser known Spielberg films. I'd only seen this film once before. Had you ever seen this, Al?
I had not. I just watched it for the very first time a couple nights ago when I mentioned to Courtney, my wife, that we were doing the movie for the podcast. She was like, "Ooh, I want to see it." And we got to watch it together, which was fun because that doesn't always happen. But James, why don't you start by giving our listeners just kind of a recap of what the movie is about?
Sure. This is a World War II film, and Empire of the Sun is about Jim Graham, a British schoolboy living a life of luxury in Shanghai. And when Japan attacks China, Jim gets separated from his parents. He returns home and waits for them, but they never show. And he eventually runs out of food, so Jim surrenders and ends up in a Japanese internment camp. There, he sets up an elaborate bartering network and diffuses tense situations with his understanding of Japanese. An American named Batsy, he takes Jim under his wing and promises to look after him when the war ends. But Batsy flees the camp before the prisoners are released, and Jim is left alone. He is eventually found by American soldiers and eventually reunited with his parents.
That's the whole movie you've just said.
Yeah, I mean the Reader's Digest version, the very short version. Yeah, we like to do a little recap at the beginning of the episode just to kind of remind people if they haven't seen it in a while. But yeah, I mean sometimes these recaps are painfully short because, this is a 2.5 hour movie that we distill into one little paragraph. But the movie, when it came out, James, was it a box office hit?
It was not a Spielberg blockbuster. It made some money. It had a $25 million budget. It opened on December 11th, 1987. It didn't do so well stateside. It opened at number 9, which I was pretty shocked about. Spielberg film, mid-80s Spielberg film. It opened at number 9 with $1.3 million. It had a lot of legs, though. It was nominated for a lot of awards. It wound up with $22 million off of a $1.3 million opening. And it made most of its money, actually, internationally. It made $66 million worldwide. So usually the shorthand is 2.5 times the budget is where profitability comes in. So this definitely made some money for the producers, but this was certainly not Jurassic Park.
It's worth adding that the film was opening in a very limited release at the beginning. It didn't get the big release with the maximum number of screens in the first weekend.
Right. It's probably one of those things where it released in December to probably qualify for the Oscars the next year.
They called it a platform release.
Right. But it still really, never made huge money at that time. And while I was watching this, I realized so many films from Steven Spielberg are about World War II. You've got obviously Saving Private Ryan and Schindler's List. He's the producer of Band of Brothers and the Pacific. Maybe some of the Indiana Jones films because they involve the Nazis. Not really World War II, but certainly it's that time. I would say as an American, I'm less educated on the Pacific theater than I am on the war in Europe.
Same. And, the movie starts with a voiceover and text on screen that gives background about what's happening in China at the time. And I appreciated that. I can nitpick and say that it's weird that it's text on screen and also voiceover at the same time.
Agreed.
personal preferences pick one, and there were a couple of missing commas in the text on screen, and I get weird about stuff like that. But I appreciated that background information because, like you say, James, I don't know a lot of this stuff. I wonder if that's an American thing. Like, Jonathan, growing up in the UK, did you have more familiarity with what was happening in World War II in Japan and China? Because a lot of this was new information for me.
Not at all. I grew up learning about World War II in Europe, and I'd heard of Pearl Harbor.
Okay.
I didn't get that news. So for me, I didn't really discover that till I was much older.
Interesting.
It's not part of our sort of school curriculum to do the American history. And there was a whole other war going on. Japan invaded China, and they took an entire strip apart from, this one area where the expats, the English, were living. And they were living like they were living in England.
Right. I appreciated the text on screen and the background, but I do have to say I was still confused by some of the things that were happening, specifically when young Jim is at this fancy, luxurious party. Then he stumbles upon a battalion of Japanese soldiers. That is accurate, I guess, that there were these Japanese soldiers within China, but it is a very foreign thing for me to think about, that there was this invading army that's kind of just sitting there. They're waiting for Pearl Harbor to happen, and then for Jim's family to kind of say, oh, things are maybe getting bad, let's go to a hotel. And, understanding how the movie's going to go, you're like, yes, this is a terrible decision. But I would think, no, wouldn't you just drive?
No, there was an element of denial. No one believed it would happen.
Okay.
And I think that's a key thing, that no one realized that Pearl Harbor was going to happen. And it was a synchronized attack by Japan. The expression, you put a frog into boiling water, it jumps straight out.
Right.
Did you put a frog into cold water and you slowly heat it? It's
Yeah.
the same thing here. I don't think people realized this would truly get this bad. Put on the news today and tell me how many people are thinking maybe in denial it won't get this bad.
Sure. I'll be honest, I do have genuine concern about, in the US, the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers and these militias that could spring to life at any moment. But even still, that's different from a foreign invading force that's just got a battalion in the field, no?
It's not, no, because I'm an Englishman, so I have very strong views about what you guys have just done with your election. But I think the Proud Boys is a genius move by Trump, because he's just brought himself a militia.
Yeah.
The invaders aren't coming from somewhere else. Your invaders are from within.
Well, that's fucking terrifying.
But I think it's human nature also to think that it's just not going to be as bad as you've seen in these nightmares and the history.
Your experience is normality, so It's a very hard jump to do.
Right. The Jews in Germany, Kristallnacht happened. There were a lot of Jews that saw the writing on the wall and left. There's some people that couldn't leave.
But there were many more that didn't. There were many more that thought it couldn't get that bad.
Right. Or they were World War I veterans. They were honorable Germans. Yeah. They were very high up.
Exactly.
And, how could this happen? This expression, leopards eating my face. Leopards won't eat my face. All of the budget cuts will only happen to other people. Nothing I need will get cut from the government, or nothing bad will happen to me. It's of course the famous, first they came for the socialists and then they came for the Bolsheviks, but it'll never happen to me. Human nature. When those people were going around saying, I'm British, that will save them. As in oh, sir, you're British. Come this way. The harbor is waiting to evacuate you. The streets will just empty for you. I love that scene when right after Jim is separated from his parents and he goes back to his home. And there were those servants, the Chinese servants that admittedly Jim had treated pretty poorly. He says to one of the servants, he goes, you have to listen to everything I say. This little, you little shit. He's talking to an adult this way. They end up going back to that home. She slaps him. And they're taking all that stuff. I can only imagine what they were saying in Chinese about their former employers.
For me, that's where the film showed its cards. It showed us that we were going to see a much more grown-up interpretation of this story. And Spielberg had never gone into that territory before. All his films were celebrating innocence. Close Encounters was celebrating innocence. E.T. is celebrating innocence. Indiana Jones, Jaws, they're just great adventures. And then This film is about the death of innocence.
Right.
And fundamentally, that's what happens to him. Jim goes through that. And we've got to talk about J.G. Ballard as well.
Yes. He wrote the novel that this movie is based on, and a lot of the stories are his experiences. It's pretty autobiographical.
Yeah. Are you aware of what got cut out of the book?
No.
What's that?
There was a whole paedophile element with the Boise character.
Oh,
Wow.
There was a very different perspective there, but I fully understand the need not to tell that story. The film had a budget bigger than the Indiana Jones movies, so it was huge. I think it was probably the right choice to not include that. You've got such a dark story, to then add an extra component like that can unbalance it. It becomes very much about something else. I remember skimming the book, and I think there was another boy that he was friends with who experienced things. And for me, though, the film fundamentally is about British class, and the writer, Tom Stoppard, who adapted the screenplay, is one of England's greatest playwrights and scriptwriters. And, and the film's about innocence. I mean, you've got Jim, who's obsessed with planes.
right.
And then there's a great scene when they get to the internment camp, which is one of my all-time favorite scenes in cinema, where he just sees an aeroplane, and you've got that beautiful romantic scene with the sparks, and he walks among it, and he just touches the plane. And as he touches it, you've got this Japanese soldier who's just a regular private, and he's just ready to shoot him, the kid, just because he's touching the plane. And instead, the three officers, the Japanese pilots, see Jim. He turns around and he salutes them, not because they're the enemy, but because there's respect, because they're pilots.
Right.
And the music climaxes, and then you fade to black, and then the next day the camera sort of dollies in, and then it pulls back out again. One of the Japanese pilots has given him his leather jacket, which he wears for the rest of the movie. And the way he torments the commandant of the camp, who was basically a middle-class guy, and Jim was an upper-class guy, that's why he was able to run laps around him, because Japan also follows very hierarchical sort of societal norms. And that's really where the film tapped into something that I thought was really, really interesting.
You're certainly right that the movie deals with these very adult themes, and so much of it takes place in an internment camp. I did a little bit feel like there was somewhat of a disconnect, because kind of to your point about how Jim is running around at this internment camp, he's got this bartering system.
But he adapts and becomes a survivor. And so many other people around him didn't. So many people of an older generation just physically couldn't. In the camp, they just died of malaria, or they gave up living. And Jim, for him, it was like a playground. It was horrible, but he was totally able to get what he wanted out of everything.
Well, it's funny you use the word playgrounds. Like, for Jim, living in the internment camp does kind of seem almost like a Spielbergian adventure, and meaning, like the other version of Spielberg, like this could be a scene from Goonies or something where he's running around and trading the shoes for the marbles and the soap and everything.
And gets a cigarette to get a chocolate bar. Yeah,
exactly.
Absolutely.
That to me felt a little bit weird.
Really?
Yeah, like life in the internment camp is fun.
I don't think it is, but have you ever seen the movie Life is Beautiful?
I haven't.
I was thinking the same thing. I was thinking very much Life is Beautiful. Basically, it's a father protects his son in the Holocaust by making him think the entire thing's a game.
Exactly.
And the boy is completely saved from the trauma.
That was set within a concentration camp.
Exactly. The boy was unaware.
Right now, we've got kids living in Ukraine and Gaza, and life carries on, as shit as it is. Life carries on. And he was able to adapt. If you're a little bit younger, you would have been lost. And if you're a bit older, you'd have been set in your ways. But Jim was that right age to just, he becomes a man, not physically, but he becomes, the death of innocence. And the death of innocence is beautifully structured. It climaxes with him moving into the American camp. And then right in the third act, his Japanese friend, who he's never spoken to, wants to be a pilot, he's killed. And all he wants to do is kill himself in a plane. I mean, it's really messed up.
Oh, yeah.
And then by the time you see his parents find him at the end, he is changed.
Sure.
And J.G. Ballard went through something. I mean, I don't know if you've read any of J.G. Ballard.
No.
I haven't.
They've made a couple of movies about his books. They made Crash with David Cronenberg.
Right.
And they made a really interesting film recently called High Rise, Ben Wheatley's film.
No, I haven't seen that.
So he wrote this sort of dystopian, broken society. And that's what he was haunted by from his own childhood. J.G. Ballard had a really privileged upbringing, and he wrote another great book, Cocaine Nights, and he wrote that book in the 70s. J.G. Ballard's interesting, and Tom Stoppard's really, really interesting, and Spielberg captured that, and with his clout was able to get this film made. I think this was Spielberg's calculated attempt at an Oscar, and he didn't get it.
Right.
He didn't get rewarded by the industry in that sense until Schindler's List.
He got a little bit of, from what I was reading, possibly a little bit of bad luck in that there was another film called The Last Emperor that
Yeah.
was nominated for a lot of things.
And it won everything. Last Emperor is great, but it's a very by the numbers epic that deals with this huge story on a big canvas. And, films like that do get rewarded.
Mm-hmm.
But I watched Empire of the Sun. I didn't see it when it came in the cinemas. I saw it in the early 90s, and I would have been about 16, 17 years old. And I was the perfect age, a film buff who wanted to make movies, who then saw this and understood the character probably way more than I would have done if I was older or younger. So for me, Empire of the Sun is one of the pinnacles of Spielberg's craftsmanship and some of his storytelling instincts.
Well, right away, I liked Christian Bale. First of all, we have to talk about how amazing this child actor is. Christian Bale, of course, now is, acclaimed, and he's just such a good actor at such a young age.
Yeah, no, it's great. I think it's just sublime, this film. But I probably have a very different experience as an Englishman watching this film rather than an American, because my cultural references are so different than yours.
What are some of your cultural touch points that you think are different?
So I really understand the whole class thing. I went to an incredibly posh school in London when I was a kid. I went to a school that was 500 years old.
Whoa.
But I get it. I get that cultural thing that Spielberg tapped into with Tom Stoppard's script about class. And for me, that was the core of the film. I mean, I didn't grow up in a house with staff, but you've got servants and you don't realize it. You're treating them like shit, like you guys pointed out. Yeah. And at the same time, it's the absolute naivety of this incredibly wealthy community of people who just don't realize that war is literally at their doorstep, and they don't realize. And by the time they figure it out, it's way too late. And I thought all of those themes were great. And also the dream of planes. I mean, I had two dreams as a kid. One of them was Lego. I love Lego. Mm-hmm. And right now I have a room in my house just for Lego with 1 million bricks in it.
Ooh.
Yeah, that's another podcast for another channel. But and the other thing was movies. I was obsessed with movies. I was Jim in some ways. I never went through his experiences, but I was obsessed with, certain things. And it really resonated with me. And also as a filmmaker, I think some of the craftsmanship in that film is some of the best I've ever seen, particularly that scene where he arrives at the prison camp and it's sort of, got this monumental wide shot of the camp, cuts to dusk. Alan Daviau, who's the cinematographer, he just was brilliant at that very soft lighting. It just was perfect. And the camera work was just some of the best Spielberg's ever done. No one moves a camera as well as Spielberg. He's the best. So for me, the craftsmanship was there. And then, the film goes into some quite interesting ideas once you settle into the camp. It's a 2.5-hour film, but I've never thought of it as a long film.
Yeah, you mentioned also Tom Stoppard. He's the one who wrote the screenplay. I first heard of him from a play he had written called Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead. He wrote Shakespeare in Love, which he won an Academy Award. He did the final rite of Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. He's done stuff for some of the Star Wars films.
Yeah, but I think also he has the perspective on British culture and values of sort of upper society. The film is so much better because he was involved.
I read that apparently it took a lot of novelists. A lot of people were given a go at it by Spielberg, and they just kind of gave up, or they didn't really know how to adapt Barry's work, and Stoppard was the one that was able to handle it.
With any adaptation, it's finding the key. I've got a book that my company are developing at the moment, and we think we found the key, but it's only taken us a couple of years to do that. You can always put the key into a single sentence, and the key is the death of innocence. Once that becomes the key, so many of the themes and the character arcs sort of can be structured around it. It could have been a very generic action adventure. It could have been a war movie. It could have been it could have been really bleak. It could have been done in many, many different ways. But I love the way that they did that. And also the money thrown at it. And it wasn't just the cash budget. It's just, what did that money buy you when you went out to China in 1987? It would have brought you so much. I mean, there were scenes with 10,000 extras. They commandeered the entire riverbank of the city. Nowadays you go there's a 100-story skyscraper every single building, but in those days it was so different. I mean, it's phenomenal resources.
Some of those extras that were in some of those scenes remembered the war.
Yeah, of course.
I'm wondering, Jonathan, what do you think of the character of Bassie, played by John Malkovich, the brilliant John Malkovich?
So I thought he was brilliant, and he was a perfect foil. He was exploitative. He was a soldier, obviously captured. He had one mission, which was to escape. Every soldier has the responsibility to escape their captors. And that's what he was doing. And yes, he befriended the boy, but he played the boy. He took advantage of him. He exploited him.
Oh, yeah.
And there's a great scene at the beginning of the movie where they're getting on the bus to go to the camp. But if you didn't get on that bus, you might have been shot. And Bassie immediately ignores Christian Bale's character and befriends this other kid. Do you want to see a magic trick? And
Right.
I thought the character was delicious. I think he was great. I mean, maybe not representation from the book, but I totally get that character. You needed a Bassie character to balance the story. Without it, you were screwed. You had the Japanese guards, but that wasn't where the story was. We didn't really have scenes with them. We just used them as a construct to get what we wanted or to fight them. The actual heart and soul of the movie is Nigel Havers playing the doctor and Bassie, and they both represent the mother and father of this boy's new life. One's trying to get him grounded and just deal with it and chin up, let's just deal with this a day at a time. And Bassie's offering him freedom and escape and maturity. So, Nigel Havers is the mother and Bassie's the father.
On that theme, Frank takes Jim into his truck, kind of like, I guess, rescues him when Jim is just like wandering around and he's kind of getting beaten up and all of his shoes stolen by a Chinese kid. And why does Frank take him in? I'm assuming there was some kind of advantage that maybe he thought he was an aristocratic boy. Why did he take him in? I didn't quite understand that.
I can imagine it's much easier to survive a war with a child at your side because you can play on the emotional impact of that image than showing up by yourself.
It's like Cal at the end of Titanic when he just grabs a little girl and is like, oh,
Exactly.
let me into the lifeboat. I've got a little
Exactly.
girl. Okay.
I'm all she's got. Yeah, I remember that. And it's genuine. It's human nature. Most people make decisions based on very, very binary, arbitrary metrics. And, someone's with a child, you're going to want to help them because it's a child.
He's opportunistic in the worst possible way, which kind of, to your point, is the loss of innocence.
Yeah. He had almost no way out. If he didn't end up in the internment camp, he was probably going to be shot
Right.
on some street corner in Shanghai, and that would be the end of it.
Right. And Jim is heartbroken that Bassie leaves the camp because he promised that he wouldn't.
Because there was no loyalty.
Of course.
Jim believed in the loyalty, and that was the final death of innocence. That was like the last layer of the onion being peeled away, where Jim now is ready to become a man, truly, because he's realized how shit everyone is. With the war turning in America and China's favor, there was no way they needed a child at that point. There were 10 Americans in a commandeered truck driving, yeehaw to wherever they were going.
Right. Jim had outlived his usefulness for Bassie at that point.
By far. I remember he'd already proven there are no landmines by going through the water.
Right.
That's a really dark, abhorrent thing to tell a child to do.
Sure.
Go through the landmines for me, and if you get through, I'll give you you can take my sidekick's bunk bed,
Right, which is an epic win for Jim, but yeah, not realizing just what he put himself through.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think the film is way more interesting than it appears on face value.
Well, and you mentioned something else, Jonathan, before we started recording about if this movie could be made today. And I think that's really interesting, is your perspective that it couldn't be made today?
Okay, so I think Spielberg is one of the few filmmakers left that can get anything he wants greenlit.
Okay.
So I think Spielberg would always be able to make that film. But we don't have that airspace at the moment in the world of streamers where audiences go to the cinema to watch event movies telling human stories, unless it's got 27 Oscar nominations and 5-star reviews, which Empire of the Sun never got.
Right.
I think it's a tough sell. And the film was not a financial hit by any means. So I think it would struggle. I also think you would shoot it differently today. This film would automatically be a $150 million movie. You could probably make it for half of that quite comfortably now with that production value. Probably even less if you wanted to, if you needed to, because I think we need to think smarter as filmmakers and make films for less money anyway, because I think we spend too much. But Empire of the Sun, it's a personal human story. Admittedly, it's got World War II and it's got planes and whatnot, and it's got Spielberg and all the bravado that he brings to his directing. But it's it's a tough sell. So would you make it today? I don't think you would want to make it today.
I think this film would be a streaming film.
It will be an 8-hour TV show. That's what it will be today. And when you're doing those big TV shows, you're doing 4 pages, 5 pages of script a day. You know, you're shooting invariably way more content than you would if it's a straight movie. So you're shooting 6, 7, 8 months. And the entire way it's being made will be a lot more generic. You wouldn't have the flourishes and the ambition because you're busy trying to shoot an episode every 2 or 3 weeks. And that's big budget TV.
You're right. At 8 episodes, the first episode will be entirely aristocrats, and the last episode would be the fall of the camp and everything.
The camp would be episodes end of 3 up until 7. 1's the setup. Number 2 is he's lost in Shanghai. Number 3 gets to the camp. 4's happy times. 5 is, oh my God, life's great. And then it starts to decline. You can see it structurally doing this.
Yeah. I think the time jump in a TV show would be less jarring. I did find that that moment in the movie to be a little bit just kind of a whiplash sort of thing where I was like, I got it. I understood that it was a time jump, but I felt like, okay, so now he's been here a while and he's got this whole bartering system and he's got his friend, the doctor, and he's got these kind of adoptive parents in the British bunker. That to me was a very dramatic shift in the middle of the movie that I found a little jarring. And I think in a series like that, in a streaming series, you might just sort of buy that a little easier.
Yeah, I think so. But also in this modern age, you probably feel like you wanted to address some of the darker elements of the book, which the film rightly didn't do. And if you do that, then you're probably in a world where you're going to struggle to get the budget level because you're going to such dark places. It becomes a vicious circle. I mean, Empire and the Sun for me is just one of those perfect movies. But I think it'll be a tough one to get made today. And I don't know if there's an audience for it. I don't know if there's an appetite to make it. It came out at that right time. And also it was made without visual effects. Anything you saw existed on screen.
Right. There are a lot of recreations of those bombers and those planes and things like that.
They had real planes. They blew up buildings, and you did that in those days. And there were clever ways of doing it cheaply, where you could do reset and go again, and do multiple takes. You couldn't do that today. It'll be so much CG, and it'll be probably for the worst, maybe. In terms of how things are shot and structured.
It's interesting how much the viewing audience knows World War II. Spielberg gives a little hint of something, and the audience knows exactly what's going on. Right from the opening crawl, he says, and the Japanese were waiting for Pearl Harbor. Not for Pearl Harbor, the sneak attack that brought America into the war, because at least in America, everyone knows that today. But the moment they said 1945, because there's some newspaper that says 45, we know, the Japanese are about to lose. And there's a thing at the end where there's this huge flash of light in the sky, and we of course know exactly what that is. We know that's either Hiroshima or Nagasaki, the atom bomb.
I learned a new word today, atom bomb.
Right.
Yeah, but ironically, they never would have seen it. Japan was only like 600 miles away.
He sees the flash, and then he looks at his mother figure dying, and then he hears on the radio about the atomic blast, and then he says it out loud. That bright light I saw, that must have been the atomic bomb. I thought it was her soul going into heaven. And I really kind of hated that moment because, yeah, we know. We just saw that. We saw the flash. We understood it was the atomic bomb. We understood what he thought it was. And then hearing it in the background, yeah, okay, then you've made it even more clear. So for him to then say it out loud, he's not talking to anyone. He's talking to himself. It's like, right, we get it.
When I first saw that scene, in that first time I saw the film, none of that crossed my mind. I wasn't as sophisticated as I am now in terms of story and structure. And also, as much as I knew what Hiroshima was and I knew what Chernobyl was, hadn't seen stuff like this. So I think punctuating that the way they did worked of its time. It might date a little bit now.
Maybe. But Jonathan, you clearly love and adore this movie, but I have to ask you, because that's what we do on this podcast, do you think that Empire of the Sun stands a test of time?
Absolutely.
Not surprised.
I hate to be a foregone conclusion.
No, that's fine. That's quite all right.
Do you?
Well, I did really kind of struggle with this movie as a whole. I really found it to be very disjointed. I felt like it was making these abrupt left turns that were just hard for me to follow. Also, like I said earlier, I did have a hard time just getting into the story because I was hung up on my questions of what was happening in China at the time, which that's my ignorance. I did not have that background information on the war, and then doing, a little bit of half-assed Wikipedia research since then, like, oh, okay, this makes a little bit more sense to me. But I was just kind of struggling with a lot of the big picture stuff, but that's not the whole movie, and really what the movie is about is, as you said, this loss of innocence and the coming of age part of the story that absolutely stands the test of time. As you said, the cinematography is just next level. It is beautiful. Overall, I will say that yes, the movie does stand the test of time because it's about this really awful part of history that, at least here in the West, we don't know a ton about, and putting it through the eyes of a child makes it accessible in a way that it's not just purely the horrors of war.
It wouldn't have worked if it was from John Malkovich's character.
Right.
It wouldn't have worked if it was from Nigel Haver's character. It could have worked if it was from the Japanese boy's character, but I somehow doubt that that would ever have been made.
Yeah. One random thing, though, and I never in a million years would have thought about this if it wasn't for the fact that the main character is played by Christian Bale. The beginning part of the movie, where he's this rich kid living this privileged lifestyle and then he loses his parents, it feels like an alternate Batman Begins, right? Like the only thing that he's missing is Alfred, right? Like in Batman Begins, Bruce Wayne comes home and there's Alfred who's there to take care of him. And in Empire of the Sun, he comes home and there's an angry servant looting the place and smacking him. So if Jim had had an Alfred, maybe the story would have gone in a very, very different way.
Okay, so I've never thought about it in those terms, and I can totally enjoy that comment.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you. But James, what do you think about the movie? Do you think Empire of the Sun stands the test of time?
I do. I think this is an important film in that it fills in a lot of holes that, I'll say it from an American's point of view, we do not know anything about this part of World War II. A lot of our World War II films are about America winning, and I think it's important that we see this perspective. I was wondering, how come we never saw any Japanese atrocities? I was thinking this was going to be, a POW camp. There's going to be executions, and there's going to be a hardcore bad guy, lieutenant Japanese guy.
I'm sure there was. They chose not to tell that side of the story.
Yes.
I think this is the transition for Spielberg from going from a savant type character who's completely in tune with the children's experience to an adult filmmaker, where he was able to do Schindler's List.
But, something that has to be said is Spielberg has worked with a lot of child actors, but oh my God, Christian Bale, just from a pure acting perspective, I think this is the best thing I've ever seen Christian Bale in. And I think he's brilliant in most things he does. He's brilliant, but I mean, to hit it out of the park, and apparently they auditioned 4,000 boys for this, to pick this kid was amazing. Just this cast of him and Malkovich and Miranda Richardson and Pantoliano. I mean, it's just so good. I think the film stands the test of time. It's well made. But the last thing I want to talk about is John Williams and that score. I almost thought that in some ways, like, it's almost a little bit too cute, some of the John Williams soundtrack in the beginning, but then as you got to the camp, the score completely changes. Act 1, Act 2, and Act 3 are so different in this film. It's a very interesting film. It's not my favorite Spielberg film, but it's a solid Spielberg film. So yeah, for me, it does stand the test of time.
All right. Well, Jonathan, thank you so much for coming back on the show. It was great having you. It was great chatting with you, as always.
My pleasure.
Thank you so much for coming on, and we'd love to have you again.
Love to.
Definitely.
I've really enjoyed this. I love what you guys do. I think you tap into something really interesting.
Well, thank you. That's very kind. I really appreciate you saying that, Jonathan. And we will definitely have you back on the podcast soon. That's going to do it for us this week. Next week, we're going to talk about a movie that doesn't take place in China, like Empire of the Sun, but one that takes place in Chinatown. We are going to be discussing the movie Big Trouble in Little China. I have never seen this movie. It's been on the list for a long time, and I'm really looking forward to that conversation. In the meantime, we'd love to hear from you. We are at Test of Time Pod on Facebook, X, Instagram, and Threads. Write to us. Let us know your thoughts about Empire of the Sun, about Steven Spielberg, about Christian Bale, about John Malkovich. All of these things. We love hearing from you. And we'll see you next time, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks, guys.